Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Fight podcast. And tonight I'm joined by David Mirsch. He's the author of the book, The Open Tomb. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment, including his YouTube channel, which will also be tagged in the description below. All right, Dave. Thanks for joining me tonight.
Sure. Glad to be here.
And we're going to be continuing where we left off last time. You had some new points you wanted to bring up. So what exactly are those points?
Oh, you'd have to remind me what we were talking about. That was a little while ago.
Well, you were going over certain points you wanted to bring in about Jesus surviving the crucifixion. I mean, that is what the last topic was about, and that is what tonight's topic is also about.
Right. Well, first of all, you have to look at the thing and say, the reason you and I are talking and the reason there's so much scholarly pursuit of this topic about whether Jesus, survived or not, you have to kind of analyze it and say, if he was just a criminal and he died on the cross, I doubt that there would have been any Gospels. I doubt that you and I would be having this discussion right now. I doubt that scholars would even be concerned with his name. To me, that's a pretty telling comment about where we are with historical Jesus studies. The consensus opinion seems to be that he died on the cross. I just find that very hard to believe that anybody would have gone and written Gospels about a guy that died on the cross. And I tend to, although scholarly consensus is very good, it can also be very misleading. And you have to take it with a grain of salt. You can't just jump on board and say, the consensus of major scholars believe this. But there are some things that the consensus goes along with that don't make any sense. Two of those really is that the general consensus is that the crucifixion took place either in 30 or 33 CE, and that Jesus died on the cross. Unfortunately for that theory, Josephus indicates that John the Baptist died in 36. So then you're faced with the situation of Jesus actually dying before John the Baptist. Now, if that were the case, and they were both kind of equal in their particular movement, I would have expected Gospels to have been written about John rather than Jesus. And I haven't really heard a good explanation from scholars how they reconcile those dates with the death of John the Baptist. If you know of any, jump in and let me know, because I would like to hear them. But to me, if you're claiming that the crucifixion took place either in 30 or 33 and John dies in 36, something doesn't jive. The other point with that is that how do major scholars, their consensus, arrive at the idea that Jesus even died on the cross? The Gospels tell us that he was seen afterwards. So the data that we have concerning Jesus indicates that somehow he was alive after the crucifixion. What major scholars, what their consensus is that, nobody really survived Roman crucifixion, so therefore Jesus must have died on the cross. Okay, but that goes against the actual data that we have. And the data is from the Gospels. So what they have to do is they have to kind of reject the Gospels as historical works in order to make their consensus work. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So for me, there are basically two reasons that we're looking at. We're looking at the Swoon theory or the Swoon conspiracy theory for why Jesus was seen alive after the crucifixion. Now, Christian apologists will, of course, say, well, it was a miracle and he was raised by God. And okay, but as an amateur historian, I'm not going to go with miracles first. They would be my last choice. And if there's a human explanation for why he was seen after the crucifixion, I'm going to go with that as more probable than a miracle. Okay. If there was no explanation for why he was seen, if it could not have been done by human agency, then I've got to look at different things. So for me, it's pretty simple. Jesus must have survived. That's why the Gospels were written. That's why you and I and every other, biblical scholar is looking at this, because there's a record of him surviving the crucifixion. So then it gets down to how and why. The other thing I wanted to go into with you was talking about Jesus ben Ananias and the fact that if Jesus, as I believe, survived the crucifixion, could he have been the same Jesus as Josephus writes about, as Jesus ben Ananias? And as I mentioned to you before, there are a lot of connections to that. There are a lot of things that indicate that that was the case. But one of the strongest is, I think, when Jesus tells his disciples that some of them won't see him when he comes again, he's basically saying he knows when he's coming again. He's basically looking at them and saying, some of you are older, you may not survive.
What do you mean by he knew that when he was coming back again? Like, I doubt he knew that the temple would be destroyed exactly at 70 and things would happen the way it did. So what do you mean by that?
Well, this involves the Jewish belief in the Shekinah, which is the presence of God. And in my research, what I looked at was, were there repetitive insurrections that could account for certain things? And if you look at the major insurrections, the Judas of Galilean insurrection was in 6, the Samaritan uprising was in 36, and the first Jewish war was in 66. Each one of those takes place 30 years apart. I believe that there is a celestial event that takes place almost every 30 years, and that is the rising of Saturn over the shoulder of the Mount of Olives, and that is the Shekinah of God coming back every 30 years. Jesus was aware of that, and that's how he could say to his disciples, when I come again, some of you are going to be gone. But he didn't come out and say this, but my thought is, you younger ones will still be alive when this happens again in 30 years. Now, all of the doorways to the temple face to the east, and they face pretty much to the shoulder of the Mount of Olives. The Jerusalem temple is really meant to mimic Moses' tabernacle in the desert. That's why there are curtains over the Holy of Holies. That's meant to be a nod to that tent, that tabernacle. And the Mount of Olives is meant to represent Mount Sinai.
So you probably know I'm going to have the same kind of response that I had last time about this, and I am. So first off, like, what makes you so certain that this isn't just some coincidence that Jesus ben somebody similar between the similarities between Jesus ben Ananas and Jesus? Josephus says that Ananas is the father, and Jesus in the Gospels says Joseph as the father. So, what other evidence are you going to use to say to the same person?
First of all, Jesus ben Ananias doesn't have to mean father. It can mean he's related, like Jesus ben David, or anybody ben David that is relating to King David as a son of, or as a relative of. So when Josephus talks about Jesus ben Ananias, he's not saying the son of Ananias. He's saying he's connected to him. In fact, Ananias is Jesus's maternal grandfather.
What's the evidence for that?
Well, if you go with my theory, what you understand is that Jesus was the son of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas.
Hold
Annas.
on. Before we go into that,
Mhm.
why do you make Ananas the grandfather of Jesus? Because Josephus says father. You're redefining it. You're claiming that he didn't mean it that way. There's another text that you use. Why don't you tell us about that one first, and we'll deal with Caiaphas in a second.
Which other one are you referring to?
The Gospel of James, because I know you use that as a major argument to make this work. So
No,
the
actually,
Gospel
I
of
don't.
James.
I don't. What I do is I look at the archaeological evidence, I look at Josephus, and I look at the Gospels. Those are my main
Don't
sources
hold
of
on.
information.
Don't you say that Anna in the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is the text I'm talking about, is Ananas, but you claim that they were gender swapped. That's what I want to ask you about.
Oh, I see.
We were
Yeah, I
talking
believe
about that
that.
last time.
The Catholic point of view is that Mary's mother was Anne. In Hebrew, that's Hanana. Okay. In the Gospels, Annas, the high priest, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, in Hebrew, his name is Hanana. They're very, very similar. What I'm saying is that whoever developed the Catholic point of view, whether they knew or not, or had just some suspicion that one of Mary's parents was named Anne or Annas. And they chose maybe to keep away from the reality of the high priest. They chose to make her mother Anne. Okay. That's Catholic. That's the
Hmm.
Catholic point of view, is that her mother was Anne. The
It,
names are too similar in Hebrew, where
yeah, but it's a different gender. So how do we like? To me,
okay,
it's a bit of a stretch. So you're saying they gender swapped the individual one way or the other.
right,
That would have to be part of your argument, which it is.
right.
So you're asking us to believe that, which is a claim in itself. And on top of that, Josephus didn't mean that Ananas is Jesus' father. It's actually grandfather, but that's not what it says in the actual text. So that's another claim. So,
Again, Jesus ben Ananias is just indicating that he is related to Ananias.
but
Okay.
that's usually taken to be father. You're
Um,
saying grandfather, but the common interpretation is father. That's his father.
no, I think there are examples. I don't have them right at the tip of my tongue, but I think there are examples where people claim descendancy from somebody and they use the term ben or bar in Aramaic. So that is not a stretch. That is not unusual at all.
Well,
It does
I
happen.
suppose you could try to say Jesus, son of David, is an example, but yet we do have other texts that specify that they mean genealogically. In the case with Josephus, when it comes to Jesus ben Ananas, we're never told anywhere that it's meant to be a genealogy between Ananas and Jesus. All we have is Josephus talking about him, and since all we have is that's the son of Ananas, that's all we have to work from. That's why the assumption's typically understood that that's his actual father. We don't have any other text to use to say that's a grandfather, great grandfather. We don't have it. That's my problem.
Except that, of course, Josephus is not going to tie Jesus to his real father, Caiaphas. Okay, he's going to tie him to a high priest who didn't have the same difficulties that Caiaphas did. Caiaphas was removed from power around the time of Jesus's crucifixion in 37. Okay, he wasn't crucified in 30 or 33, he was crucified in 37. So, in order to preserve what he is saying, and I'm pretty sure that because Jesus was still a wanted man at that point, they weren't going to tie him down too much to his family. So Josephus throws out the name Ananias to connect him to somebody. Whether he intended it, to be picked up on later, I don't know. But he connected him to Ananias. That's why he's Jesus ben Ananias. There are a lot of things that that writers, especially like Josephus, who's our main source of history for that time, were not going to write about Jesus because he had basically escaped from the crucifixion, the Roman crucifixion. He was a wanted man. They're not going to, it's like with the Gospels, they're not going to put up his name and address and his family and his wife and all these other things because the Romans are going to clamp down on them as soon as they read that.
Let's go back to Caiaphas. What is your evidence that Jesus is actually the son of Caiaphas?
Well, first of all, there's the Miriam ossuary, and it says, it's etched, Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas. So we know that Caiaphas had a son named Jesus. We also know that both Jesus and his father were considered carpenters or builders. They were both considered that. And they were both, if you look at the birth narrative and how the family was treated, given gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they weren't poor carpenters. They came from a substantial family. You don't give all that stuff to a poor family that has no security because robbers are going to come along and take it right away. But you can give it in accordance with the son of a priest or a high priest. That would just be a typical, means of celebrating the birth. And that's what happened with Jesus. Could they be priests, both of them? Yeah, absolutely. Priests had side hustles. They did other things than just, the priesthood. They took care of other things as well. And as Josephus tells us, when Herod was building the temple in Jerusalem, he took 2,000 priests and trained them to be builders so that only priests could enter the precincts of the temple. So that they didn't have just ordinary guys building the temple. They had priests doing it. Does that relate in the Gospels to Jesus and his father? Yeah, possibly. If they're called carpenters, you don't... Here's the thing. You don't, in a small town like Nazareth is supposed to be, which again is a consensus view, that it's a very small town, rural, mostly farming, I would imagine. You don't have two carpenters there. They're not going to make a living out of that. So then the Christian apologists came up with this idea that, they, probably helped build Sepphoris. Well, yeah, possible, but they're not farmers, so they're not tied to the land. So they could just move to Sepphoris to do their work on the city. They didn't have to travel the couple of miles each way carrying all their equipment every day to go there to work on the city. They would just pick up and be there and work there. The argument that, Jesus was a poor carpenter really doesn't bear out what the Gospels are saying about him. He's clearly, and this gets into the messianic secret, he's attempting to be a political Messiah. And so is John the Baptist. John is the theological one, and Jesus is the military one. And this is kind of brought up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they imagined or proposed that there would be kind of a two Messiah cycle.
So you're taking the infancy narrative in Luke seriously. You think that's historical?
You're too focused on that. That's just a beside. That's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. One of Mary's parents was named Anne or Ananas. Wow. Well, let's look at the Hebrew names. Well, the Hebrew names are very similar, and you would have to know the context of when they're used to determine their gender. as far as I could tell. And I'm not an expert in Hebrew, so I'm just kind of winging it and trying to figure this thing out. But it's not the main source of information about him. It's just an aside. Could that confirm that Ananas in the Gospels was Mary's father? Possibly. Yeah, possibly. There's a connection there. There could be. What we're looking at here, Jacob, is not hard and true facts. We're looking at, first of all, possibilities, and then trying to build that into probabilities. That's how you develop, historical reconstruction. And all I'm saying is that there are a lot of things that are connected, unusually, that aren't really brought up. For example, getting back to the Perugia, Saturn comes around every 29.4 years to the same place on the eastern horizon. Okay, that's almost every 30 years. It takes 15 years to go out, 15 years to come back. That's what I'm saying is the Shechinah. And I think that Jesus was fully aware that it was due back in 66 CE. And he actually, according to Josephus' story, if you accept that that is the same Jesus, he does come back. He actually comes back in 62 because his brother James, the head of the Jerusalem church, has been killed. But he stays away from the population for 4 years until 66. And then he comes out as Jesus ben Ananias. If you read that very carefully, that passage about him in Josephus, the way he is described is the way he was presented in the Gospels. He's kind of portrayed by Josephus as a hick, that he goes around preaching this, woe be to Jerusalem, using pretty much the same words that Jesus used. There's a lot of similarities there. And if Ananias is the Annas of the Gospels, then you have a stronger connection. Is it impossible that this is true? No. It's possible. Is it probable? Well, if you connect all the dots, I think it's more probable than not that that's what we're talking about. You have to understand who Jesus was and what he was trying to accomplish. And to me, when I read the Gospels, I see them as very layered, but the bottom line is they're political propaganda, as I've said to you before, which means that they needed to be written when these events were taking place, because there's not really much of a shelf life for political propaganda. You're not going to write political propaganda decades later. You're going to write it when things are happening. One of the things that Josephus indicates that he didn't pick up on, that indicates kind of what Jesus was trying to accomplish when he talks about the parable of the Samaritan woman at the well, is that Josephus names a town where the Samaritan uprising takes place, near Mount Gerizim. And the town is called Tirathaba. Okay, this is in Josephus. What Josephus never understood was that is not a name of a town. That is a Hebrew word, comment, suggestion. And what it breaks down into is Tirat Haba'at, which means the place of the choice in Hebrew. And I suspect that that is where the Davidic kingdom was broken up, where the 12 tribes came together near Jacob's well at this place called Tirathaba and decided to dissolve the United Kingdom. Jesus, I believe, was one of the leaders of the Samaritan uprising because of the parable of the Samaritan woman. And I think John was there too. John the Baptist was there too. Josephus doesn't give a very clear account. He doesn't name the leaders, but he doesn't give a very clear account of who survived and who did not survive. It's kind of indicated or hinted at that the leaders may have gotten away and that Pilate was going to search for them and kill them. And this, I would suggest to you, is actually why John the Baptist was beheaded, because people knew that, he was involved in that. And as Herod Antipas said, I need to get rid of this guy because he can draw a crowd. And obviously, with the Samaritan uprising, he had done just that. He had drawn a crowd together. So there are things that scholars miss that have a real important impact on the story of the historical Jesus. And throughout the Gospels, what Jesus is trying to do is to reform that united kingdom, the kingdom of God's covenant, because he feels that without that, they cannot defeat the Romans. And so he is dealing with all these separate provinces to try to get the tribes back together again, re-earn God's covenant, and thereby get God's help in a war against Rome.
Now, I want you to expand on the conflations that you're doing with Joseph Caiaphas before I get to before I describe more of my issues of with what you're saying. How many different individuals do you claim are the same person as Caiaphas?
Well, we got Joseph, Jesus' father. We got Joseph Caiaphas, who I think is his father. And we have Joseph of Arimathea, who I think is his father. So there's three personalities or three different characters that are actually one human being. And they're all named Joseph, and they all have a pretty big impact on Jesus' life. Caiaphas, I think, because he wants Jesus to be crucified, understands that there is a chance that his son could survive that. If it's managed properly, if they handle it, correctly, he can survive that. Joseph of Arimathea, I think, as I've said before, Arimathea is a word in Greek that is a combination of two words. Airo, A-I-R-O, in Greek means to take away, to take down, to remove from, as, and this is from Strong's, as from a cross. And Mathea is the gift of God. So you have Joseph Arimathea, who takes down Jesus, the gift of God. I think that's just a designation. I don't think it means that you have to look at him as a completely separate person. I think that was the way Romans would have handled it. I've told you this before, that according to Philo, very often, and he was aware of this, crucified victims could be taken down from the cross under certain circumstances when there were certain holidays. Now, Jesus was crucified during Passover, but Philo also indicates that they could be taken down by relatives or relations, I think is the word that's translated for that. The idea that Joseph of Arimathea, who was not indicated as being a relative of Jesus, would have had a very difficult time taking him down from the cross, getting permission from Pilate. But Joseph Caiaphas, as his father, would have been able to do that, would have been able to go to Pilate and say, this is my son, I want to take him down from the cross. And like I say, according to Philo, and I can give you where the quote is if you need it, that was done. Those things were done. So the idea that, oh, this would never have happened, as the scholarly consensus continues to plead, is nonsense. Philo tells you it was done. So there's nothing unusual about Jesus being taken down from the cross. To me, that's just, I don't know, maybe they skipped over that part in Philo. I don't know. But it's there, and it connects. It explains what the Gospels were talking about. So to me, you got Joseph, his father, Joseph Caiaphas, and Joseph Arimathea, all being the same person. I don't think that's a bit of a stretch. Is it possible? Yes. It's not impossible. That's the question you have to ask when you go through this stuff. Is this particular data point impossible? Or is this interpretation impossible? Could it not have been that way under any circumstances? And that's just not going to work. Of course it's possible. Is it possible that Jesus could have been drugged on the cross? Yes, it's possible. Not impossible. Could he have survived? Yes, he could have survived. That's possible. Could he have lived to be a ripe old age and come back again in 66 when the Shekinah was showing up over the shoulder of the Mount of Olives? Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. So people struggle with the swoon theory, and I just don't get it. Again, if he died on the cross, that's the end of the Jesus story. Nobody's going to write anything about it. They're not going to talk about it. They're not going to start a new religion over it. The fact that he survived created all of this 2,000 years later and in between. You just can't look at it. I have a hard time looking at it any other way. If somebody can come along and say, well, a dead Jesus, that's my argument for why the swoon theory doesn't work. Why? Tell me why. Because, again, and this was Captain Dadpool's main argument, was that he was convinced that Jesus died on the cross. Well, where are you getting that information? From a connection to other crucifixions? That's great. But things that seem similar are not always the same. And if you have data from the Gospels that indicate that he was walking around afterward, then he survived the cross. Hard for me to understand that kind of illogical approach. Anyway.
I want you to pay attention to what you just said. Things that aren't that seem so similar aren't always the same. So
Correct.
we'll bring this up. I brought this up last time.
Yeah,
Brady Siegel. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Well, we're gonna come back. We're coming back to that right now. So your argument, yeah. So this is my problem. I think about this every time lately. Is when you compare Jesus ben Ananas to Jesus Christ, I think about this.
Mm-hmm.
This is a real situation where two baseball players, a doppelganger, have the same height, same looks, same facial features, everything.
Right.
And they're not even related. They're not even genetically related.
Right.
And so, okay, so if situations like this can happen, or you have two people with the same name, same job, a lot of similarities, that doesn't make them the same person. And we know it's just it's a doppelganger. It's a freak coincidence, but stuff like that can happen. Is my point. You bring up Jesus ben Ananas, and you see some parallels between that individual and Jesus Christ. Now, here's how this is going to sound, not just to me, but to other people and scholars. Like, okay, so you have to claim that Josephus doesn't really mean Ananas is the father of that Jesus. It could be grandfather, but we don't have any textual evidence to prove that. You then have to depend on Anna in the Proto-Evangelion of James being gender swapped. So basically they turned the masculine Ananas into the feminine Anna. That's another claim you have to make. But the next thing you do is after you get done with conflating Jesus ben Ananas with Jesus, who you assume Jesus survived the crucifixion, which you would have to say that to make that work. Because how did he live to be Jesus ben Ananas? How does that work? So what I'm saying is you're taking one theory, you're building other theories around it, subsidiary theories to make it work, and then you conflate several Josephs into the same person as Caiaphas. You see you see my issue here?
No, I don't, honestly. Look at these two guys, these two baseball players. Are they the same as what I'm talking about? No.
Well,
They're
you can
similar. They're
you can
similar,
you can
but they're
see
not
you
the
can
same.
you can see the analogy I'm trying to make. So even if you don't agree with it, you see the analogy I'm trying to make.
I think it actually proves my argument. These guys are not the same. These guys are not the same as the situation that I am claiming. They're not. This is very weird for sure. These baseball players, that's really unusual. Absolutely. And your argument is that, because I'm making my claim, this claim with the baseball players disproves my point. No, it doesn't. They're not the same situation. Okay. These are two different people. They are
Well,
different.
that's
We see that they're different people. What I'm saying is the Josephs that are involved are the same person. Okay. These two are two individual guys that are the same. What I'm saying is that the Josephs, the three Josephs that I'm talking about, are the same. That's different. That's a different
let's
theory.
let's we'll come back to this Brady thing in a second, but first, can you be very specific? Recap on when you date the Gospels. I know you already stated earlier about you don't date the Gospels decades later. Can you specifically tell us when you date the Gospels exactly? The Synoptics.
Synoptics between 37 and 41.
Okay.
Without
So why do you
doubt.
date? Other than that, it can't be later, in your opinion. What other reasons do you use to date the Gospels super early like that? Can you go over that?
Yeah, because of the Alexandrian riots and the idea as a result of those riots and Philo going to Rome to talk to Caesar about it, and basically Caesar blowing him off, not even listening to him. And Caesar then claiming at that point that he was going to have a giant statue made of himself and put into the Jerusalem temple, thereby desecrating it. The Roman army was actually helping some of these rioters, some of these Greek rioters that were coming out against the Hebrews. They were burning synagogues. They were killing people, Jews, left and right. It was at the time one of the biggest conflagrations, I think, that the Jewish culture and society had really had to sustain or deal with. If you understand that, if you read Philo, and it's in Flaccus and it's also in the embassy to Gaius, the reports of what was going on, it's pretty clear that that was a major, major problem for the Jewish population. And the idea that there was going to be this giant statue of Gaius Caligula put into the Jerusalem temple was what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about the abomination of desolation. The Greek word for abomination is a singular neuter word. In other words, it's a thing. It's not shields, spears, military, whatever. It's not a general. It's a statue. It's a thing. That's what Jesus was talking about. He's talking in future tense. If this happens, and it hadn't happened yet, as it turned out, the Roman general that was ordered to carry it out, knowing that it would create a major, major conflict with the Jewish people, stalled. And he stalled long enough until Caligula was actually killed. And that ended that. That ended the idea that statue was ever going to be put in the Jerusalem temple. But when Jesus is talking about it, it's a very real threat. And he's hearing about it. He sees what's going to happen. He knows, he's telling his people, look, when this happens, when we're surrounded by the Roman army, basically, and the Roman army was in the Middle East, obviously, there were three groups of Roman soldiers that were in and around that area, and they were already on the march. They were already, taking care of some of the outer synagogues and stuff. Jesus knew full well what was going to happen. Now, I don't think he ever envisioned that Rome was going to tear down the temple because they wanted that for a house for the statue. What he was going to do, because it was desecrated, he was going to tear the temple down. This is one of the things that he's accused of in the Gospels, that when he is on trial, somebody comes along and says, yeah, and he was claiming he could tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. So these are all things that are happening very, very quickly, very close together. When Luke writes his gospel, he dedicates it to Theophilus. Well, it just so happens that the high priest in the Jerusalem temple between 37 and 41 was Theophilus ben Ananas. So I'm guessing, with all the other information that I've come across, that is who Luke is writing to. He's letting him know what's happening. He's filling him in on the politics of Jesus. He's, making it clear to this high priest, this stuff is happening. There are other changes in the Gospels that indicate that those were the dates that they were written. One of them is that in Mark and Luke, which I believe is the correct order, Mark, Luke, Matthew, for various reasons, when they talk about saving Jairus' daughter, by the time it gets to Matthew, Jairus isn't used. The name isn't used. Jairus is a synonym for Herod Antipas, who controlled the area east of the Jordan where the Havoth Yar was in ancient times. So the gospel writers used Jairus to indicate that's who they're talking about, the one who controls the Havoth Yar, which would have been Antipas. Well, he was removed from power in 39. So Matthew probably was written post 39, which is why Jairus wasn't used in that same story. It just makes more sense than somebody coming along and saying, hey, let's try and prove that Jesus was a real prophet and have him prophesize the destruction of the temple in 70, but we'll backdate it, so it looks like he's talking about this as a future event or whatever. It's so complicated and convoluted. No. He was aware of what was going on with Caligula and what possibly could happen to the Jerusalem temple. It's not a post facto, hey, the temple's destroyed. I guess we'll, let Jesus have that one as a prophecy. I don't think so.
I mean, I don't think it's hard to believe that other people before 70 thought that the temple could be destroyed hypothetically if there would be a war, since things were worsening at the time. Right. Slowly there were more and more rebellions. I don't. I think it's the way the Olivet discourse is constructed. But we'll come back to that in a second. You mentioned earlier that you talked about James succeeding Jesus. Now, the Gospels don't talk about James succeeding Jesus, not our canonical Gospels. They never address it. But something like it is discussed in the Gospel of the Hebrews. So I'm going to expand on my thoughts here on the Gospel of the Hebrews. So I double checked it because last time I forgot that Barabbas was in the Gospel of the Hebrews. He's in there. So that means as early as the late 30s, the Gospel of the Hebrews, late 30s being the earliest time I would date it, early 40s being the latest I would date it. But the Gospel of the Hebrews suggests that, so it mentions Barabbas. So that means that the Barabbas story was there. And I think that the author of it was basing it off of the Yom Kippur in Leviticus. Because you had one that was a lamb. I think the other animal was a lamb. I don't remember. But you had one animal that was brought up and it was killed, and the other one would be allowed to live to bear the sins of Israel, something like that.
Right.
Now, in the Gospel of the Hebrews, it's kind of imitating that situation, sort of. But what's interesting is that the Gospel of the Hebrews yet fails to specify that Jesus died for the atonement of sins. Now, one of the canonical Gospels actually does the same kind of thing, and that's Luke. And I had a discussion with Bart Ehrman recently on this, because he said the Gospel of Luke does not have atonement for sin. Jesus' death is not atonement for sin in Luke's Gospel. It doesn't specify that. But the same thing is true in the Gospel of the Hebrews. It does not specify that either. Both Gospels have the Barabbas character included, but yet the atonement for sin is not present in either one of them. But it is present in Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's in his letters. It's in his authentic letters. And so what I'm saying is so that's there, but a lot of the information that's in the canonical Gospels is not in the Gospel of the Hebrews. The Gospels are expanding on that narrative. So even if they were pre-70, which I don't think that, I think the Gospel of the Hebrews is pre-70. I don't got a problem with that. But the canonical Gospels that are a lot more theologically developed, I'm still convinced that most of them is 2nd century of Mark. The shorter ending, the Mark with the short ending is the late 1st century. I'm not convinced that they're early, like you are. And when you look at the Gospel of Thomas, which preserves a tradition, it talks about that James was chosen to succeed Jesus while Jesus was still alive, because Jesus' followers were asking him, "Hey, who are we to look to whenever you go?" He said, "Look to James, for whose sake all of heaven and earth was made." So there's nothing there indicating to me that, oh, okay, so I'm planning a conspiracy. I'm gonna pretend to die on the cross, and James is gonna succeed in my place. So he'll be the public leader, and I'm secretly pretending to be dead, ruling the movement. So that's my problem.
Yeah, it's based on the fact that, and I'm going to guess here that you take a lot of the consensus views. You don't, and I don't mean this to sound real blunt or rude. To understand Jesus, you have to understand that he's trying to foment a rebellion by surviving the cross. So if he survives the cross and no rebellion starts up, which is why Judas, I think, killed himself, what you have is a criminal who has skipped out on his execution and is not going to hang around to be found by the Jewish authorities or especially the Roman authorities. So he's going to disappear. He's going to go away. Okay? He's a wanted man, and if he's captured, he'll be crucified again or just beheaded. So it's not a question of Jesus saying to James, "You lead after I'm gone."
Before we keep going, let's talk about, you just said that Judas killed himself, so you're talking about Matthew's account where he hanged himself?
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Yeah, I was just about to say that Mark doesn't talk about that detail, so I was like...
Mark doesn't talk about a lot of things.
Sure, but if it ain't Luke, Judas explodes everywhere.
Right.
Not in Luke, but Acts, the second volume.
Right.
He doesn't talk about it in the actual gospel. And in fact, there are similar. I'm not getting. I don't have the details in front of me right now, but there are some parallels between Luke and the Gospel of the Hebrews that Jim Edwards talked about. Well, actually, I kind of did already earlier. They both lack the atonement for sin, so that's an example.
Right.
So that actually reminds me of another point that I need to make before I forget, and that is, it's an example of how a later gospel can, what I'd say, theologically regress, because Luke knows Mark. Now, I also think you knew Matthew. I know you flipped the arrows. You had Matthew using Luke instead, but anyway,
Right.
I think he's using Matthew. And what's happening is, regardless if he used Matthew or not, he had Mark in front of him. We'll agree there. And so he encounters the atonement of sin in Mark, and then in my view, Paul. But I know you date Paul's letters after the Gospels.
Right.
I don't agree with that. I mean, the Marcionite version of Paul's letters, which is abridging canonical Paul, is later, but I think canonical Paul is before our Gospels. Let me just finish this. I know you want to talk.
Absolutely.
I'm almost done. So, I say that I think that Luke disagreed with the other text about Jesus' death being vicarious redemption, and he decided that, okay, I'm going to go with this much older view, the pre-New Testament view. Well, there was no New Testament per se at this time, but he decided to regress to the Gospel of the Hebrews. Like, yeah, I like that viewpoint, that Jesus' death is not atonement for the sins of humanity. And the reason why I bring this up is because sometimes when we think something is older, it's not. It's regression.
Could be.
So I'll stop there for now. I'll probably come back to it a little later. So what do you want to say?
Well, again, you have to understand what Jesus was about. He's not about atonement for sins. He's about fomenting a revolution. Okay? That's his goal. That's what he's working towards. He wants every Torah follower to atone for their behavior so that they can reestablish the covenant with God. That can't happen if the Torah followers are not strictly following Torah. So that is what he is trying to accomplish. And he's going to, and if you look at a map of where he travels to almost all of the provinces and even Tyre and Sidon to get this message across to people. You have to atone, you have to clean up your act, because we want to reestablish the United Kingdom, which will give us a much greater chance of defeating the Romans. If we're all together on the same page, we got a much better chance of defeating them. So it's not a question of, hey, I'm going to die for, your sins. It's a question of, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise from the dead because God is on my side. And once you realize that, it'll make it easier for you to atone for your own sins and start following the Torah. Well, that's my take on it.
I do agree that Jesus was both an apocalyptic prophet and also a zealot. I think he wanted to restore Davidic rule in Judea, which didn't work out, obviously. And my issue here is, you said earlier, the main point you've been making this entire discussion is the death of Jesus could not have happened on the cross, because if he just died on the cross like everybody else, there would have been no Jesus story to be discussed. Now, there are like I believe I discussed this last time. I mean, there are major heroes in Greco-Roman myth, like
Hmm.
Romulus
Hmm.
and many others. And so what makes Jesus the exception here? Why does he have why does he have had to have done why did he have to survive this? Why couldn't the others have survived their supposed deaths? Why is Jesus an exception here?
Well, I already said it. He understood, and I think his father understood that you had to go through this trial and tribulation of the cross in order to get people to believe that God was on your side. Now, we already know, and this is where the mythicists make a big mistake. We already know that the Gospels were written using Greek heroic literature and things like that. They use that to embellish Jesus's reputation. That's typical of propaganda. That's nothing unusual. Um, so, what the mythicists don't understand is that, okay, the people that wrote the Gospels used those things for a living person, a historical person. It doesn't mean that he didn't exist. It means that that was their method of promoting him with literature that the population would have been familiar with. Oh, look, here's Jesus. He's doing just the same thing as, Hercules or, whoever. He must be pretty great. And he's going to lead us into war. Wow, he's heroic. He's amazing. Not one thing that the mythicists claim really refutes a historical Jesus. It's just parallel interpretation of what could have been written about a historical person. They've taken it in a different direction, but it doesn't refute a historical person. So he's not about atonement. This is why he's different from other Greek and Roman
I'll
heroes.
put it another way. I'll put it another way.
Cool.
There are famous people. Let's go. Let's go. Let's start with the modern world real quick. There are famous people that passed away that others have claimed. Oh, that person is actually secretly alive. They faked his death like that.
Elvis.
That yeah, I was just about to mention Elvis. Um, but obviously there's no evidence to substantiate that belief. Um, and there are I'm trying to think of another one. Yeah, I think the other one's name is David Koresh. With
David Koresh. Yeah.
yeah, the whole Waco thing.
Right. Right.
So I mean, he didn't survive anything. Neither of those two survived anything, and yet they both have fame associated with them in death as well. So that's my point. Is it's like they also people have visions of dead people. They claim to anyway. Uh, okay, let's say that Bob over there died, and somebody has a dream about Bob. Like, I saw the spirit of Bob. And when you read Paul's letters, you see stuff like that where Paul's like, I had a vision of Jesus.
Yeah, I know.
He came across other people that had visions of Jesus. They're not claiming that these physically survived the crucifixion. There's no evidence in his letters that was believed. And in the Gospels, when there's a story of Jesus walking on water, it was like they saw a ghost. That's what the text is saying. So that's my problem. Is how do you get past that to try to prove that it had to be a physical body? It has to be the physical body of Jesus that was alive, still alive.
I think you have to get by the idea that, and this is you've obviously seen Paul Oggia's argument for hallucinations, and it only takes one, maybe two people to have a hallucination. They believe it so much they pass it along to other people. Great, blah 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 blah. Cool. Great. Doesn't refute anything. They could have actually seen a real living Jesus. Okay. He's based that theory on creating this hallucination hypothesis, which isn't, believable. Great. But it doesn't refute the fact that those people could have been talking about seeing a real historical individual. Okay. Again, it's a parallel interpretation of the data that we have available. Nice. Obviously, he wants to believe that Jesus died on the cross, and therefore any sightings of him had to be hallucinations. That's his theory. Great. It doesn't refute the fact that that person that they saw, that Jesus figure that they saw, was not a real person.
Before you continue, I mean, this argument's way before Apologia. So this is
Oh yeah,
this is
yeah, I
not
know.
this is not new.
He's a big proponent of it
Like,
lately.
I did not get it from Paul. I did not see
Okay,
Apologia
that's okay.
thing.
I've
Yeah,
just seen him a lot online, with this
yeah, sure.
hypothesis.
I know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure you do. Again, people are going with the consensus that Jesus died on the cross because people generally died when they were crucified. If you are planning to have somebody be crucified that you want to appear to live or be risen from the dead, it's possible. You can do it. People don't want to think that. They want to think, oh no, there's got to be another reason why people were seeing, Jesus after he died on the cross. Has to be. No, could be. I mean, could be. But the fact of the matter is, it could also be, and it's more easily explained, that he survived the crucifixion. And there are plenty of arguments that indicate that that's exactly what he did. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't the Swoon theory. It was the Swoon conspiracy theory. He planned it. His father planned it. They knew what was going to take place. They knew how to, interrupt certain things and make it look like he died so that he could rise again and be the chosen one of God, the Messiah, the chosen one, because he survived, or he was brought back to life by God. This was their game plan. Is it possible? Yes. Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. These things could have been done. If you want to, stick with the fact that he died on the cross, you don't have any evidence for that whatsoever, that he died on the cross. You have corollary evidence that people generally died on the cross. So therefore, Jesus must have died. That's a pretty weak argument when you have the gospel saying that he survived the cross. The difference
No,
is
they don't claim he survived. They claim he rose from the dead.
yes. Okay, but if you take the miraculous out of it, he survived the cross. Okay? I can show you how it was done. It was done through magic tricks. He's known for being a magician. Turning water into wine is a magic trick. The empty box at the tomb is a magic trick. These are all things that are done today that were totally capable of being done back then 2,000 years ago. Why people struggle with that fact is because they are so locked into scholarly consensus and their own belief system that he had to have died on the cross. It's irritating and nonsense. There's no data other than corollary data that would indicate that he died on the cross. Okay. And if you discount miracles and the Gospels say that he was up and around and letting Thomas poke a finger into his wound, he survived the cross. Period. I don't know why people struggle with that, but they want to.
I'm going to take this super chat because it's been sitting there for a while. I fish and tie. Thank you for your super chat. Josephus is the only one who knows Jesus survived.
I don't know whether he did or not. He's certainly talking about him in that episode that he writes about Jesus ben Ananias. I suspect that he knows who he is. But again, there's a thing called what we call damnatio memoriae that the Romans would have placed on Jesus once they found out that he had gotten down from the cross and disappeared. They would have destroyed his tomb. They would have said to put it out there that anybody that is heard talking about this guy Jesus or writing about him will be killed. We're gonna stop this rumor right now, because their whole point of crowd control was the threat of crucifixion. And if people got to believe that you could somehow survive it, that policy of Rome as a threat kind of disappears. It's like they don't want anybody to think you can survive a crucifixion. So they're going to clamp down very hard on any comments about Jesus and surviving the crucifixion. And that's what Josephus did. I think Josephus knew who was in charge of the Samaritan uprising. If you look at the Samaritan woman by the well, you understand that Jesus was connecting with the Samaritan population, trying to encourage them to join. Okay, I think Josephus knew that Jesus was leading the Samaritan uprising, but he never mentions a name about anybody leading it. He doesn't mention that name. Do I think that he knew about Jesus ben Ananas? Yeah, but when he knew about that, was it far enough down the road that he felt safe even bringing that name up? Maybe. Maybe he felt far enough away and enough Caesars had passed through that he no longer felt particularly threatened by that. Certainly the Jesus ben Ananias, who arrives in 62 in Jerusalem, and kind of maintains he hides his identity from the population for 4 years until 66. Does this come out? Does he start, being connected to Ananias, according to Josephus? In the meantime, he would have been hiding out. He wouldn't have told James that you're in charge of the church. He would have been hiding out. As it turned out, James had a following of his own. He was considered righteous in his own way. And he was obviously put in a position of, handling the church. Now, the other thing, too, that's really important to remember, and I don't know why people don't accept this or understand this. Paul had nothing to do with Jesus's ministry. That's why he doesn't talk about any biographical information. He was persecuting the early followers, and then he suddenly has this miraculous vision on the road to Damascus where he thinks he sees or hears Jesus converting him. And then he converts. But when he converts, he doesn't preach Jesus's message. He doesn't get along with the disciples. The reason why is he's trying to steer that ministry, that, point of view of those followers of Jesus away from rebellion. Paul is a Roman citizen working for Rome, maybe on his own. I don't know if it was officially sanctioned, but on his own. He started out beating these people up, maybe even killing some of them. And then he has this, singular, nobody else really saw it or heard it, vision of Jesus. And then he converts, and then he takes the message in a whole different direction, which diffuses the revolution, the rebellion, and takes it into what we know as Christianity.
He says all governments are appointed by God, and that rebellion against the rebellion against the government is rebellion against God. In Romans 13. Yeah.
Okay. And he also says, how did he find out about Jesus? Well, through visions and through Scripture. Well, Scripture just means writings. So he could have easily been talking about the Gospels. Easily.
I would say the Gospel of the Hebrews. So he had and Thomas. So I think he knew those written sources. I'll disagree on the canonical Gospels, but he knew those. So I think he knew a gospel of some kind. Sure, I just don't think it's the canonical ones. And he has of course, he has a Eucharist in there, which is more cannibalistic. So it's an anathema to Torah orthodoxy, drinking Jesus' blood as wine and eating his body as flesh, eating his flesh. It's being called bread. But yeah, I mean that's getting into Paul and the Roman agent and the Herodian stuff, which doesn't really, in my view, have any bearing on if Jesus survived the crucifixion or not. He's
Well,
just
it
Paul's
does
just
in a
trying.
way, because if you discount Paul and what he says, you take all of that out, and you stop asking yourself, well, why isn't he mentioning the crucifixion? Why isn't he mentioning this about Jesus? Because he's changing the narrative. So you need to know who Paul was, what his agenda was, in order to recognize I can't use Paul as
Well,
anything
here's
about
my
the historical
let
basis.
me make a different point here.
Okay.
Because when it comes to the resurrection part, I'm not so sure he is changing your narrative. Because you look at the resurrection in the Gospels, like when they saw Jesus, it is like, oh, he's like a ghost. Like they weren't sure like what he was. There was confusion on what he was after he rose from the dead.
Well,
And in Paul, it's just another different. It's another way of describing the same issue. That they thought it was a spirit. Now, yes, even in Paul, he does say he was buried and he rose again 3 days later, which you could have a physicality interpretation of it, a physical resurrection interpretation of it, if you want to. Um, but it's like to me, they're trying to explain a situation that makes them think he rose from the dead because of reports that he had been seen in some kind of way. But this kind of thing happened with other historical figures,
mhm.
mythical figures, not just with Jesus. And that's my
And with
problem.
ordinary
And
people.
people don't say that those other people survived their deaths. They don't make those arguments about those other people. That's
Mhm.
my issue here.
Well, you have to understand the whole story, though. If you are trying to get away from the Romans because you have been convicted and sentenced to crucifixion and you survive that, let's say that, and this is a possibility, that Jesus took a Nazarite vow sometime in his life. And going through what he went through with torture, which was minor, and the cross, completes his Nazarite vow. Okay, that's what he's said he will do. I will do this for God. I will take these risks so that I can show the people that God is on my side. Okay, so he goes through that. Guess what? You think and you have to understand, Nazarites are not allowed to cut their hair, not allowed to cut their beards. When he's completed the vow, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to cut his hair, shave his beard, look a lot different so that he's not recognized in the streets, so that people aren't going to turn him into the Romans. This is why the people that he ran into didn't recognize him at first until he started to talk. He had a different look, which is completely in keeping with somebody who has escaped their punishment. You go away, you change your look, you change your lifestyle, you do things differently because you're still a wanted person. Again, that's possible, not impossible. And they did that in the tomb before they brought him back out. When he was in there, they cut his hair, they shaved his beard, they treated his wounds, and they took him out. And then they sealed the tomb.
I think a problem but this is probably the last point that I'm going to make for tonight is in the Gospels, there's stories about doubting the resurrection. That's something else I discussed with Bart Ehrman recently, and I asked him about because a course. He did a course on the other doubting Thomases. Because I don't think the swoon theory properly accounts for that. Is why were there other people doubting that Jesus rose from the dead even after the so-called resurrection? What was causing the doubt?
The
And
same
to me,
reason. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
and well, just so I can finish,
Yeah.
because it's a situation. Doubts like that would exist if no real proof was being offered he did rise. And it's other people telling other people that he did, but he's not being seen by those other people that are doubting. You have some people claiming that they did see him, but of course, when these claims are being made, that's when James is leading the church. And if I remember what Bart said correctly, I think he said this a while back that people may have confused James, the brother of Jesus, with Jesus because he would have looked like Jesus. I think he said something like that, or someone did. But next time, because I'm sure we'll have another discussion at some point, and I'll find where Bart said that and pull up the clip. Or maybe I'll find it in a second, but I'll let you respond while I find it.
Well, it's a pretty easy one to respond. You doubt. You have doubts, even though, the Gospels talk about him walking around and seeing people. Again, the consensus view is that he died on the cross. They have doubts. All those scholars doubt. They are not sure, so they go with a correlating argument of, well, people died on the cross, so therefore Jesus must have died on the cross. They doubt the fact that he could have survived, but it's possible. So to doubt it without further examination is terrible scholarship. You have to look at it and say, okay, well, they saw him, apparently. Maybe he didn't die on the cross. How could that have been achieved? How could that have been accomplished? Is it possible? And like I keep saying, of course it is possible that he could have faked his death and survived and recovered. His wounds were not that great, even though the Christian apologists will trot out doctors and this, that, and the other thing to kind of show how horrible the torture was and how horrible the crucifixion was. Well, it wasn't that horrible. It was a Jewish scourging or whipping, which was a whole different ballgame from a Roman whipping with a different tool or whip to use. And it was 39 lashes, which Paul indicated on more than one occasion that he survived. The nail holes, not a big deal. They're not giant nails. They're thin nails. They weren't meant to support his weight. They were meant to pin him to the cross like you would pin a butterfly in a collection. The real support were ropes that were tied above his elbows. Okay, so we're not talking about huge wounds and terrible torture here. And if he was drugged, he could survive because he had, been drugged with maybe painkillers, with drugs that made him seem like he was in a coma, and therefore they took him down. These are all possible things. These are all possible scenarios. More possible, more probable than just claiming that he must have died on the cross because everybody died on the cross. He had an agenda to accomplish. He had the means and the tools to make it happen. It's totally possible. And I would say to you, it's more probable than the fact that he died on the cross and that this dead criminal got, gospels written about him and people starting, a movement about him because he was dead on the cross. No, sorry. He had an agenda. His father had an agenda. They accomplished it. He was seen walking around. Other doubting Thomases, if people came up to him and said, look, we saw him walking around, are they still going to doubt? Are those Thomases still going to doubt? Yeah, probably, until they get firsthand knowledge themselves and say, you know what? Yeah, I saw him. I talked to him. I listened to him. If they don't get that, do they keep doubting? Yeah, could do. That's human nature. Some people will go along with what other people are telling them, and some people will be skeptical. That's pretty much normal human behavior. So to me, that the other Thomases, the doubting Thomases, it's nothing for an argument. I mean, really? That's the argument? No, sorry. Again, all I look at is, are things possible? Could it have been accomplished? And I have yet to come across anything that says, nope, couldn't have been done. It's that particular thing right there that leads to this particular thing right there would have been impossible. And the idea that Roman soldiers were so good at, figuring out that a crucifixion victim had died is complete rubbish. Okay. The reason they had a rule in the military that if you let a crucifixion victim survive and get down off the cross and disappear, you would be liable to take his place and you would die on the cross. You don't have those kind of rules for something that never happens. Now, we have had a death penalty in various parts of this country for, since the beginning of this country. Has it stopped any murders? Anything that deserved capital punishment? No. Could Roman soldiers have missed the fact that Jesus was drugged and he appeared dead? Yeah, it's possible. So that argument, Christian apologists should just pitch that one out and say, you know what? No, people make mistakes, even Roman soldiers. Even when there's laws indicating what will happen to them if they make mistakes, it still is possible that they made a mistake.
I think I found the video I was looking for.
Okay.
It's taking a second to download. While I wait on that, we'll pull up a couple more super chats. Fish and Ty, thank you for another super chat. Were the Roman soldiers in on the conspiracy? Is it very risky to volunteer to be crucified and expect to live? What if the soldier breaks his legs?
Then you'd have a different story. It would be a different story. But if he appeared dead, and they poked a spear into his side and blood and water came out, and they were convinced he was dead, there's no need to break the legs. So when Joseph Arimathea comes to Pilate and says, hey, I want the body, the Roman soldiers are going to go along with that and say, well, we've already checked him and he appears dead, so go ahead and take him. If he's drugged, and here's the other thing, and I checked this with one of the nation's leading hematologists, a doctor that specializes in blood disease and blood conditions. You got two situations with the story of Jesus where he has a combination of water and blood, supposedly. The night before, he sweats so heavily that he has blood pouring out of him. Okay? That's hemolytic anemia. That's a breakdown in the red blood cells. Then when he is stabbed with a spear, he has blood and water coming out of that wound. That's hemolytic anemia. So I asked this doctor, is there any condition that would account for those situations medically? And he said, those are symptoms of a genetic disorder called G6PD, also known as fauvism. It is a condition where the person that has it, if they eat certain foods that trigger the condition, their red blood cells break down into the plasma and it looks as if it's watery blood. Okay? It's predominant in Jewish populations in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is actually called the Jewish disease. That's what was happening with Jesus. So he was already struggling with that. And he was given drugs.
That's only in the Gospel of Luke, though, isn't it? There's the specific reference of sweating blood. It's not in Mark. It's not in Matthew either.
Does that matter? Again, if you're looking at political propaganda, you don't have to have harmonization. You don't have to have each succeeding gospel being exactly the same as the preceding one. It's propaganda. As political situations change, you change some of the narrative or you write it a little bit differently. It does not have to harmonize. It's not history. It's propaganda. So if it's only in Luke, I'm going to go with that and say, okay, there's two things. And I'll tell you something else. Asenath, the story of Asenath, she sweats blood too. Okay, so you got two people somewhere around the 1st century that are important enough to have works written about them that both sweat blood. To me, that's an indication that either she's aligned with him politically or she's genetically aligned with him, which seems more realistic.
Well,
because that disease is handed from mother to son.
we'll come back to that. I got the video loaded in here.
Go ahead.
I got it's in lower quality because I got it downloaded in a faster way because the other downloader's taking a bit. But all right, this is a video that was I think it's like 10 years older.
Yeah, older. Much older.
They look Bart Ehrman and Michael Lacuna.
Yeah, Lacuna.
We'll get to 2 hours and 33 minutes because somewhere around there where the part I'm looking for. Actually, it's closer to 2 hours and 34, but it's around 2:33. So I'm having a hard time getting it right there. Hold on. We'll just start
without
here.
appealing to miracles. Let me give you a second, rather crazy idea. I'm not claiming this is what happened, but it does strike me as interesting. In the Syriac tradition, Jesus was allegedly known to have a twin brother, Didymus Judas Thomas. Looked just like him. Here's the hypothesis.
All right, so I slightly misremembered. So yeah, he was talking about Thomas in this situation, not James. Let's keep going.
A few weeks after the resurrection, somebody from a distance saw Judas Didymus Thomas and said, "There's Jesus!" And he disappeared. A couple of days later, someone else saw him. "There's Jesus again." People thought they saw Jesus. He died. He must have been raised from the dead. Is that plausible? Not really. Is it more plausible than a resurrection? Yes. Any historical explanation is more plausible than a resurrection because the resurrection is a miracle and historians cannot prove miracles.
All right, so I'll stop it right there. See, this was a long time ago. I think it was more like 20 years ago now, actually. But yeah, this was a while back.
Yeah.
But he made a similar point there that I made tonight. And it's just what I was trying to make tonight because I think it's more likely that somebody else represented Jesus, whether it's because of confusion, that in that case that would be accidental and that individual took advantage of the confusion, or it was purposeful, which in my view would not require as much speculation as would be required with the Swoon theory. So why couldn't it have been because of what Bart said here, Thomas, the twin brother? What would be your issue with that, Dave?
Again, is it possible? Yeah, absolutely, it's possible. Possible. Do I believe it? No. It's a convenient explanation for somebody that won't let go of the idea that Jesus died on the cross. So if my theory tends to point to the fact that there are things that were done, Jesus was a magician, his father was in charge of, his father wanted the crucifixion. Caiaphas wanted the crucifixion. They could have cut off his head. They could have stoned him. They could have drowned him. Any which one of which would have meant his death, his absolute death. But a crucifixion can be faked. Okay? So to me, it's here we go again with people hallucinating and thinking they're seeing Jesus. All those Thomases that think they see him, did they see him really? Could have. My attitude is easily could have. They didn't want to accept it. They didn't think it was true because they were convinced he died on the cross. Were they aware of what I'm saying, that these things could have been done so that he did survive the cross? Maybe they weren't aware of those possibilities.
Let me bring in another point connected to Thomas. Thomas's gospel has no miracles. It has no crucifixion. It has no resurrection at all. When the gospel was found, it fascinated scholars very quickly because it reminded them so much of Q. Now, they don't think Thomas is Q, but the point that I'm making is there's a specific scholar that I want to reference, Elaine Pagels, that is, because she makes an argument that the Gospel of Thomas was known to the Gospel of John. And Thomas, it seems to suggest something along the lines of people think, they're not people, sorry, let me rephrase, let me start over. That people can find their own way to God. People have the light of God in them already. By the way, just so the chat understands, I don't believe in the Q source. I'm just saying scholars found Thomas to be reminiscent of Q, but I don't currently believe in the Q source. It's a hypothetical document that we have no proof ever existed.
Right.
So Dave and I will agree there.
Yeah.
Thomas. So I think Thomas was. I do agree with Elaine. Thomas was known to John. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Thomas was known by everybody in the New Testament. But anyway, I definitely think John knew Thomas, and that John is trying to counter Thomas because in John, Jesus is the light of the world, and only Jesus is the way to God. So it's elevating the importance of Jesus, making people more dependent on Jesus rather than independent of Jesus. So that. And you kind of see that happening as the text is as the traditions are developing anyway, even if you ignore Thomas and its involvement. The importance of Jesus is certainly being elevated. It's certainly being escalated over time.
Right.
So John calls Thomas the doubting Thomas. I think he called him doubting Thomas because John wanted to tackle the issue in ways that the Synoptics would not. Because how do you deal with the Gospel of Thomas having no miracles? That's just unacceptable. So you got to do something about that. You gotta make the assertion that Thomas came around later. Oh, he believed later. That's the ticket. That's my way. I'm going to dance around the issue. Yeah, he wrote this stuff first, and then later. And then later he changed his mind, apparently. He's like, oh, now he believes he rose from the dead. When Thomas was so emphatically resistant of the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. But John would have us believe that he got convinced at some point. Because Thomas he's present in the prior Gospels, but John is like, no, y'all don't address the issue at all. I'm going to address the issue. I'm going to make it look like Thomas got convinced later because no one else talks about that. So John's dealing with it. John's claiming that he got convinced later. I think when you see stories like that, that's another thing there that makes me resistant of the idea that Jesus survived the crucifixion. I'm open to evidence for it, of course, but those are one of my hangups there, Dave. Is what I'm trying to say. That is making me skeptical still that he survived the cross.
Well, if you have difficulty accepting that after the evidence that has been produced in the Gospels, that he was up walking around and talking to people, that must mean that he survived, then you're never going to be convinced. So we're at that kind of a, brick wall between you and I. That, that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's just your feelings about the subject. That's how you view it. I view it completely differently. I view it that the Gospels are reliable as propaganda. They don't have to harmonize, but they do have to stay on message. By the time of John and Thomas, the agenda has changed. The idea of a military revolution against Rome has gone by the wayside. So they're talking theologically. They're more interested in theology and building their agenda towards what they, perceive wrongly that was Jesus's message. Okay. That includes Thomas, that includes John. The Synoptics, I think, were written before Thomas. You know that. Everybody after that, everybody after 41 has their own agenda for what they're going to do with this story. And few of them, if any, adopt the message that Jesus was trying to put out there, and that is we need to revolt against the Romans. They are desecrating God's country. They need to go. After 41, after the Synoptics, that ministry, that point of view, that claim disappears. It disappears.
One of the reasons I think Thomas is early is because it lacks all that extra information. And
it's the same way with Paul, though. If your agenda is different than the message of Jesus, you're going to write something that doesn't.
Well, Thomas doesn't even know about the claim he even rose from the dead. Paul does. He knows about that. So that's a big difference there.
Does he say he doesn't know, or does he just not include it?
Well, Thomas also knows about the idea James succeeded Jesus, which is hinted at in the Gospel of the Hebrews.
That's not the question I'm asking. Does Thomas?
I am addressing your question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
And I also mentioned that Elaine Pagels thinks John knows Thomas as well. Okay. I brought that up.
Right.
Yeah, and there are some scholars out there, and I'll be bringing one on the channel soon that does believe in the priority of Thomas. Now, it doesn't mean that the whole Thomas was early. I mean, there could have been parts of it that were added later, sure. But my point is, even if you don't think it's early, which you don't have to think it's early, it's still a tradition that James succeeded Jesus, and it doesn't know anything about Jesus survive a plan from to survive the crucifixion. There's no hints of it in there at all, and I find it. And you say that it's not in there. So how do I know? How do I know that means it's early? And it didn't just leave it out later. Well, they didn't typically leave things like that out. They honestly didn't. It's unusual. And the early church fathers that talk about Thomas don't think it is later. They don't. Now you have Cyril of Jerusalem. He's writing in the 4th century. He talks about a Manichaean Gospel of Thomas, but that's not the same text that we have. It's a different text. Now, Origen of Alexandria talks about the Gospel of Thomas in the 3rd century. And Papias, writing in the early 2nd century, knows a logia of Thomas. So there's an early awareness of it. However, it's the whole text or parts of it, doesn't matter. Some form of it is known very early in the game. But it doesn't really matter if you think it's early or not. The Gospel of the Hebrews is also very well tested. And presented a major problem because the early church fathers thought that Matthew actually wrote it, which was a quandary. It put him in a quandary because they opposed it. They didn't like it. It was different from canonical Matthew. They called the followers of it heretics. Now, not all the church fathers are negative about it. They were not super polemical, but some of them were. So it was a huge quandary. They didn't try to claim that, it's abridging our Matthew. They didn't say that. With one possible exception, Epiphanius, if you take the position that the Gospel of the Ebionites is the Gospel of the Hebrews, but that's a different situation that I'm not going to get into. But in any case, the point that I'm trying to make is there's a wide awareness that James succeeded Jesus. And in the Gospel of the Hebrews, Jesus appeared to James, gave him a post-resurrection appearance. Jesus' resurrection appearance to James is also in Paul. So they have that in common. So Paul didn't leave that out. And so, again, my point is, because I'm going to summarize the issues I'm still having with your position. You got to roll multiple people into Joseph as the same person.
Right.
You got to roll multiple people into Jesus as the same person. You have to gender swap Ananas as well in order to make the claim that Ananas is Anna. Would you use the Proto-Evangelion of James? So you actually are using later texts to support your theory.
Actually, I was using Catholic point of view, not so much the Proto-Evangelical.
It's still a later situation, regardless, and they do get it from the Proto-Evangelion of James anyway. So it's the same thing. And so my point is, it's like you're stacking several claims on top of another claim, and you're stitching them together. Now, in my view, one could defend the Swoon theory, I suppose, without having to make all of those claims. I brought this up before, like Edward Dodge. Although his take on the Swoon theory is very different from yours. He has Jesus surviving the cross and then dying after like 40 days, something like that, if I remember correctly.
Like Schoenfield.
What was that? You said Hugh Schoenfield?
Yeah, that was his position too, that Jesus, Passover plot, that he survived, but he died, sometime shortly afterwards.
Probably, from the injuries. And
Right.
So, and there, I'm like, okay, well, I don't agree with that, but we're not rolling multiple people into the same person. We're not saying that there's a conspiracy with Caiaphas. So there's not as many claims, if you get what I'm saying, that are associated with it. So the burden of proof isn't as high. But with your position, it's different. So,
well, when you're trying to reconstruct historical situations, you look at pretty much everything you can lay your hands on, and it's like a game of connect the dots. You go from this dot to that dot to this dot to that dot, and you ultimately wind up with a picture. That is what I have tried to do. So when I come across things like Jesus ben Ananias in Josephus, and the description of that Jesus matches the gospel Jesus, and he seems to be connected through family to somebody named Ananias, which is the long version of Annas from the Gospels, then I start to make other connections. If he survived, could he have survived? How old would he have been? Is this possible? Unfortunately, Josephus doesn't give us some of that information, which would have cleared it up. But the point is, if you're going to reconstruct the life of a human being historically, yes, that's what you do. You pile evidence on evidence or data on data. You look at all the things that you can look at to, make sense of the data that you do have. So when I tell you that Philo talks about, crucified victims being taken down from the cross to enjoy the same benefits of holiday that other people do, well, then that connects to what Jesus went through. Is it possible? That's what you have to ask yourself is, of all these things, is it possible? Or are you going to say to me, it's impossible? What you're saying right now is you don't believe it, which is different from those two questions, whether it's possible or not. If you don't believe it, you don't believe it. That's your choice. But if you come to me and say, well, yeah, it's possible, then you have to look at things a little bit more closely and say, well, if it's possible, is it more or less likely that that's what happened?
I suppose it is. I don't think it's likely, but I suppose it is. And I'll respond to the Philo thing real quick. If I'm going to take one more super chat, then I think we can close.
Okay.
What Philo said does remind me of what Josephus said about 3 dudes being crucified. 2 of them died and 1 survived. So that happened around 70 when he was when he encountered the 3 guys and 2 of them died. He begged Titus, like, hey, I saw these dudes before. They were former colleagues of mine. Let's get them down, man. So 2 of them die anyway, even though they had top physicians, I would assume, trying to help them out, and 2 of them died and 1 survived. And the fact that 2 out of 3 of those people died, I mean, I think that alone is a strong argument. That, I mean, and now I know you're deferred to the one guy that managed to survive, probably barely. But I'm like, if you have the odds of 2 out of 3 chances, as based on that situation alone, that somebody's got to die from being on the cross, even if it wasn't for too long, because they suffered brutally on those crosses for a little bit, and 2 of them still died, even though they were taken down early. So that to me doesn't bode well for the chances that Jesus survived the cross. So that's my response.
Can I jump in, or you want to close
Yeah,
out?
go ahead. Yeah, respond real quick before I take the super chat.
What you're looking at is 3 situations, and there were tens of thousands of crucifixions that we don't know anything about. We don't know if people survived them. We don't know what happened to all those people, whether they had their legs broken or not, whether they died on the cross. We don't know anything about. You're taking a micro chip of information and expanding it to include the story of Jesus. That's not really how you do historical research. You can't just focus on those 3 people from Josephus and say, well, if those were your odds, would you take the chances? The other argument is, yeah, if you're a religious fanatic and you want the Romans out of your country and you're willing to risk your life to do it, which people in the military do all the time, that's not a big deal. That's very, very possible, very probable, because Jesus was a religious fanatic about getting the Romans out of the Middle East, out of Palestine. And he was willing to take those risks. If he had died on the cross, so be it. But if he survives and he gets people fired up to fight against the Romans, even better. Anyway, go ahead with your...
I think if you super chat, your theory is much more believable than mysticism. I think you meant mythicism.
Yeah, mythicism is, again, if people like Carrier and stuff had looked at it and said, well, yeah, but all of this stuff that I'm coming up with could be applied to a real living historical human being, his argument would disappear. Okay, it's dependent on the fact that he doesn't associate it with a human being. He associates it from the get-go with a myth. So mythicism just doesn't hold any water. You got to say to yourself, it's possible that they were attaching these things to a real person to make them look even better. It doesn't refute a historical person at all. Anyway, you want to get out of here?
Yeah, I think we covered on the main points we wanted to cover. And just to remind everybody real quick, the link to purchase the Open Tomb will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And David Mirsch's YouTube channel will also be tagged in the description below. And with that being said, David, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Jacob. As always, thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.